Let me get back mentally to John Berryman for a second. And let me like bring you guys back. Like if you guys watched that stream on Monday, it was mostly on John Berryman. And we were talking about John Berryman's dream songs. That is his probably like greatest set of like continuous poems or continuous poem. Like I said in the live stream description, you could think of the dream songs as a book length poem because in some respects it is. And I say that because although I think it's a great work of art, the individual poems are I think there are probably great individual poems. I mean, there are, especially in the kind of if you really like internalize this strange lingo and this his diction, what he does with punctuation, just what he does structurally with like these like 666 poems, the way that he builds narrative, turns away from like pieces of narrative that he builds. Um, it's really dependent on lots and lots of individual poems. Like he wrote it in that way, right? So even if we have great individual poems in the collection of that, entire 385 dream songs, I would argue that you need basically the weight of all of them to make this book work. So therefore, you probably don't need as many individually great poems to pull this off, right? And of course, the question that emerges: well, would it be a greater book length poem if every single poem in the collection, all 385, was just like flat out great? And I think it like if you were to run, we could talk about probability spaces in the arts as well. If you run that probability space 1,000 times, just imagine it, right? We have a book of poems, right? 385 of them. It functions as a book length poem as well. Would it be better if every single one of those poems was great? You run that simulation, I think 1,000 times. I think there might be some situations where no, having every poem be great would be some kind of detraction, right? It's possible, right? We haven't seen something like this, so on the one hand, you could conceptualize it, but it's also a little bit tough. But I mean, like, you could also though see that you run that 1,000 times, like, and you have many situations where Berryman's actual book of poems, like in this Cosmos, right, the Dream Songs, the 385 that we have and that we're talking about, they, in many of those like instances, they're probably going to be surpassed, right, by the things that poet was able to pull off, like with that kind of sheer kind of like brute, brunt force. And we said so. Look, like because of what it does with narrative, it's fairly complex. And that's perfectly fine. We could actually use though pieces of John Berryman's personal biography to at least let's call it make the poem more concrete, make it more tangible. We have now specific anchors so we could attach ourselves to. Correct. We have like bits of biography that would say like, oh, like we understand what this line is about, like that makes sense now. Oh, I understand why he chose that adjective because clearly it's describing this situation or that situation from his life. But we also said that once we get comfortable enough with the poems, it's time to slip away from those anchors. Okay, it's time to take those anchors away and to not use the biography, right? Like it's not so much that you shouldn't. It's you have to find ways to also start to transcend what is given to you in the poems by virtue of knowledge of the biography, right? You have the anchors. Fine. Finally, you're not drowning anymore in these poems. Time to step up, time to think about this a little more deeply, time to understand why a poet writes, because John Berryman didn't fucking do this just to talk about his personal life. He had other things that he needed to say and to do, right? This cannot be fully his life. Like And all these like bad takes about the role of biography on an artist's work, right? It's people that are not artists, right? They must believe that this has to be John Berryman, right? And it becomes uncomfortable to think about the poems in a broader way, because people understand personalities, people understand biography, but the thing that is, Will Women had that poem in Leaves of Grass. I forget if it's just titled by the first line, but it's something like, great libraries do not close your doors to me, right? I provide what you needed most, for your well-filled shelves. And same thing with like, I feel like a lot of the analysis of like, perhaps like a more complicated poetry. It's so easy to just like default to some kind of like, I don't know, let's just call like whatever the critical consensus is as like the null position, the null hypothesis, right? Everybody wants to like fucking, they just spout null hypotheses. Annoying, right? Anyway, so this is where we are. We're gonna now go through the rest of the Dream songs through 77. I think I selected maybe 4 or 5 more from this point. Could be more. And then we have some other poems on top of that. So let's read Dream song number 26. And I believe, so this is my copy of the Dream songs. Let me just make sure, because the 77 Dream songs are divided into 3 parts. I think 26 is the final poem of the first. Yeah, so 26 is the final poem of the first part of the 77 Dream songs. And the reason why I chose it, it's not even because I necessarily think it's more, it's better or whatever than these other poems, or that even like necessarily links more thematically or whatever, but it's because, like I said at the beginning, people say that Dream songs defy narrative and narrative building, but I think I made a pretty good case as to why Dream song number 1, probably is, out of all the Dream songs, that probably should be the way that the Dream songs begin, right? And 26 as being the Dream song that ends part 1, right? We have to assume like if there's a division here artistically, right? You have to then assume there's a reason for that, right? And if you can't find a reason, that's the fault of the artist, right? The artist like made this arbitrary distinction, division. Said I'll divide my 77 Dream songs into 1, 2, 3. Then I'll let the reader just fucking deal with it. I don't have a reason for it. That's an artistic failing. If you make this choice, this choice has to I don't want to say like you need to have a conscious reason, right? No, but it needs to add somehow to what's going on, right? So, and I'm going to show that this is an appropriate ending for the first part of the 77 Dream songs, knowing that we have a total of 385. All right, that's all that I'm saying, right? Don't get your panties twisted. The glories of the world struck me, made me aria once. What happened then, Mr. Bones? If B.U. cares to say. Henry became interested in women's bodies. His loins were the scene of stupendous achievement. Stupor, knees dear, pray. All the knobs and softness of my God, the ducking and trouble it swarm on Henry at one time. What happened then, Mr. Bones? You seems excited like. Fell Henry back into the original crime. Art, rhyme, besides a sense of others, my God, and a jealousy for the honor alive of his country. What can get more odd? And discontent with the thriving gangs and pride. What happened then, Mr. Bones? I had a most marvelous piece of luck. I died. So just purely what, if you want to say that poems have a plot, I mean, I guess you can. There's like some plot, right? In any book length poem to some degree. There has to be. I mean, like, we know that there is some kind of conclusion here. Like, I had a most marvelous piece of luck. I died. Okay, well, what could this possibly mean, right? What could this possibly lead us to? Like, what is this about? What is this for? Right? Clearly, there's like a dividing line. And we also know that he clearly does not mean himself, right? He didn't actually die, right? I mean, he could have died, like in the metaphorical sense. Like this could be about like some ghost. Like you could do that reading, I guess. But whether or not you read it as a ghost, or whether it's Henry still alive, confronting parts of himself and parts of his past, and sort of almost deriding himself. Not almost. I mean, he is doing that many times. Yeah, like the result is the same, right? There is still this like self confrontation, right? So like, don't get too carried away. Like, aha, like this has to be about a ghost. Like that would change everything. Like that's the fucking that's like the sixth sense like bullshit plot twist. Like, I mean, who cares, right? Who cares about that? We want like a substantive twist, and we have that. Whether or not you choose to read it as a ghost, because the confrontation here is much more existential than it is, one of like, am I dead or not? I mean, whatever, right? So another reason why I chose this, not only to show that structurally, like, yes, like there is something to say about there being a coherent, respected narrative in the dream songs. I mean, this is like an example of his like minstrelsy, right? Like, one of the really kind of controversial parts about the dream songs is like, he has a character that by Berryman's own statements, right? This is John Berryman saying this. It's not just like someone bullshitting. He he does say that I have a character that refers to Henry as Mr. Bones, who often appears in blackface. Like these are actual quotes from him about this work. Now, we could say that this is like, we could say like, oh, we don't have to take the word of any artist ever, fine. But I mean, the fact is, like, on some level, biography matters a little bit. The words of an artist matters just a little bit, and in conjunction with like this kind of like Black American vernacular, I guess, as imagined in some ways. Like it's not I wouldn't like call it anyway. But as imagined as by John Berryman. Like it does exist, right? So like, what does that mean? What does that entail? What is the right way to think about it? So far, like in this poem, have we seen anything offensive? So let's just read it one more time. Is there something here that is either offensive to your like personal moral sensibilities, as far as like what ideas should be out there, what ideas we should be supporting or disregarding? And is it somehow like not working perhaps in some other way? Like, is it like, like generically offensive, right? We could think of this in the kind of like woke SJW sense, or we could think of this in, we could kind of like more broadly, like redefine that word a little bit, I guess. So let's just go through one more time and just see how this feels. The glories of the world struck me, made me aria once. Okay, so first line, right? I mean, it's an interesting start, right? They made me kind of like into a song, right? The glories, like me having like Henry does eventually experience some kind of loss. We know that, right? Perhaps it's never, we could guess what it is, but it's never truly defined, right? It's open ended enough that we could say there's probably several kinds of losses we could discuss. And he says, like, perhaps before this time, the glories of the world struck me, made me aria once, right? This is kind of like, this already is like the fulcrum of the poem in some ways, right? We know that we need to slant this somehow. This is a setup. We need to refract it. We need to follow it up with some kind of refraction. We can't just do woe is me bullshit. We need not reflection, right? Which is what woe is me bullshit is. Like, it wouldn't be art if it's purely reflected. It would just be woe is me. How do we get away from woe is me, and how do we get away from the biographical stuff? Like, let's see what kind of problem that he's experiencing outside of what we know about John Berryman himself. Like, let's think about Henry the character, right? Henry, as like we said last time, this was his wife. He asked his wife, one of his wives, what is your most hated name? And she said Henry. So the dream song's about this guy. That's the name that he chose. So we could disregard. Let's just turn that off. Just take it down a little bit, right? We could turn it back on if we need to. If we get a little bit scared about our own interpretive powers, that's okay. So the glories of the world struck me, made me aria once. What happened then, Mr. Bones, if BU cares to say? Henry became interested in women's bodies. His loins were the scene of stupendous achievement. Stupor, knees, dear, pray. So, okay, so let's just assume, right, for a second that this is like, what is like, this article calls it so-called black. Let's assume that this is like so-called black, right? What is the function? Like, what is it doing? Well, it seems to me that Henry, we know the way that he's been presented so far. He's kind of mysterious. He doesn't really want to talk about his issues openly all that much. We know that he has problems with openness, perhaps with like other human beings. And this is how he starts his whining. The glories of the world struck me, made me aria once. Okay? So the role of this like blackface character, right? We want to just like assume that John Berryman is correct when he said that this is a blackface character. Okay, let's not have that argument. Let's assume that that is so. This character is, it seems to be he is pulling this information out of Henry, who would otherwise just shut the fuck up and be this like, mysterious douche in some ways. He's dragging it out. And the assumption is the character must know that this is the case because this keeps happening over and over again, right? This blackface character who keeps referring to Henry as Mr. Bones, he keeps extracting information out of our friend Henry. And a lot of this information is like very negative about Henry, and it's information that otherwise would be sort of kept in Henry's head, would not be communicated. So to the degree so far that this is blackface, that this is a, either a black person in blackface or a white person in blackface, they are playing at least a character that is not the most conventional character, either in poetry or in minstrelsy or in, kind of like almost any other category that we could think of. Okay? So after he asks this of Henry, like, what does he drag out of him? This. Henry became interested in women's bodies. His loins were the scene of stupendous achievement. Stupor, knees, dear, pray. I mean, this is well written, right? Henry, right? Henry happened, right? Henry, like this is an interesting line, right? Like literally, what happened then, Mr. Bones? Like the answer is Henry. Henry happened, right? So, how did Henry happen? Well, the blueprint of Henry was, it seems, he had to become interested in women's bodies. He had to become obsessive about it. He had to, damage himself in some way with women's bodies. That had to happen. Right? I mean, this, this line alone, right? It does so much to damage Henry's like reputation as a, I don't want to say good person, right? But as a person that is that easy to respect, right? Especially like the way that he described it, like his loins were the scene of stupendous achievement, right? This so-called blackface character is making this white character into a complete fucking buffoon. I mean, so far that is what happened. Henry continues, all the knobs and softness of my God, the ducking and trouble it swarm on Henry at one time. What happened then, Mr. Bones? He seems excited like. Again, like get him to talk. Fell Henry back into the original crime. Art, rhyme. This to him is a problem in some way, right? Art is a problem in some way to him. Right? Is art like is he motivated by art? Is he motivated by this, right? His loins. Right? Does the art is art his means of exercising the loins? Like why is this his original crime? But whatever the answer, right? There could be a couple of answers, but he's answering it. Art rhyme, besides a sense of others, and my God, and the jealousy for the honor alive of his country. What can get more odd? I mean, this is an odd combination of traits. I mean, all artists have an odd combination of traits. And discontent with the thriving gangs and pride. What happened then, Mr. Bones? I had a most marvelous space piece of luck. I died, right? The dying was lucky. The dying was lucky because, you know, all that the blackface character did here was get the white guy to pillory himself. And by the way, the words themselves, right? What happened then, Mr. Bones? If BU cares to say. I mean, they are well written. What happened then, Mr. Bones? You seems excited like. What happened then, Mr. Bones? Like, even the fact that, like, Berryman knew enough that in a fucking 18-line poem, you need some variation, right? With a poem like this, you need some variation. If B cares to say, well, we can't get rid of a second line just yet. Let's transform it. You seems excited like. This is both, like, egging him on. Here. And now, we're not going to reflect. We're going to refract. When we get to this part again, we're gonna chop this line off. We're gonna get Henry, right, to ultimately pillory himself. We don't even need to set it up this time. We know that he's gonna do it, right? The blackface character knows. He has the wisdom. He has the knowledge to know. Okay, so again, when we think of John Berryman blackface so far, let's just keep that in mind. This is literally what's happening between a so-called white character and a so-called blackface character. Okay, this is what has transpired. So 26, we skip a few. We're still kind of here right now. You would think like, okay, he said that he died in that previous one, right? This is how it ended, and we had already, you know, this was poem 26. We're now at poem 29, right? So we had a 27 and a 28 to kick off part 2 of the first 77 songs. And in the first 77 songs, part 2, this is how after I died, like, comes into the picture. This is how, like, the narrative develops. Again, let's just remember that there's a reason here for this. There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart so heavy. If he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, and all them time Henry could not make good. Starts again always in Henry's ears the little cough somewhere, an odor, a chime. And there is another thing he has in mind, like a grave Siamese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profile reproach of. Ghastly with open eyes, he attends blind. All the bells say, too late. This is not for tears, thinking. But never did Henry as he thought he did, end anyone and hacks her body up and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows. He went over everyone, and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn them up. Nobody's ever missing. So here we have the narrator kind of like taking on a little bit of like, I guess what some critics call blackface as well here, like in All Them Time. You know, to the degree that, you know, people would call stuff like this blackface, which has been said, like I've, you know, kind of prepared for this a little bit, reading kind of the surrounding discussion, and we're going to talk about some of that discussion. But this could be generically working class. This could be generically ethnic, right? This could be, you know, Henry's inner white ethnicity, whatever it was ancestrally coming out. Like, it could be anything, right? We don't necessarily even have to take that position, but we know that that is an open interpretation. That is fine to say. And I mean, just think about how, like, again, we get like a new presentation of like Henry's like melancholy, right? There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart. So just visually imagine that, right? There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart. It's almost like the start of a little bit of a fairy tale. So heavy, if he had 100 years and more and weeping, right? And if he had weeping as well to go with it. Sleeplessness also to go with it, right? So this is how his life is getting expanded. He has 100 years, right, to deal with this heavy thing sitting down in his heart. Then he says, no, he has more than 100 years. Nope. He also has the weeping to go with it. And he has a life in these 100+ years that also is a life without sleep. Okay, so we keep fucking like increasing essentially his like productive lifespan over and over again. In all them time, Henry could not make good. Right? And I just find that so lovely. Like, it's such a lovely, open-ended way of talking about Henry's problems, I guess. In all them time, Henry could not make good. Like, what does that mean, could not make good? All right, like this could mean almost anything, and this could refer to almost anything. This could refer to lots of things. And in fact, we get more of this open-endedness in the next lines. Starts again always in Henry's ears, the little cough somewhere, an odor, a chime. Like what is that referring to? But we know that, here's the thing, we know that the way that the mind works, the way that smell works, it's not even explicitly connected to, you know, let's say like an event that's causing melancholy. You know, that itself does not have to be the case. But we get it here anyway, right? Like, so somehow maybe it's connected, or maybe it's one of those like tangents. Like, you know, to me, one of the most like distinctive smells is, I remember like a few years ago, I went to my old elementary school, and like that classic cafeteria smell of like, you know, burgers, pizza, peanut butter jelly sandwiches, chocolate milk, fries, fruit. It has such a classic smell to me. But, you know, if I think back to like bad things in my childhood, I might still, you know, have like these happy, like I love, you know, the smell of cafeterias. I love that association. But my, you know, memories of like any kind of melancholy or like whatever, they're still going to be tied into these happy odors, right? And we don't exactly know how this plays out. It's never defined, and it doesn't have to be defined. We know that in all them time, this like ever increasing fucking lifespan, Henry could not make good, right? He remembers the cough, he remembers the odor, he remembers the chime, but you know, what does that mean? And there's another thing he has in his mind. So we have this as a fulcrum. But guess what? We're pivoting once more, right? This is dense enough. Like, we spent a long time here, okay? But we're gonna stack density, right? Because you have to, like, opening up the second part. You need something like this somewhere, even if it doesn't come right away. Not saying it has to come at the beginning or, you know, a little bit ahead. Personally, I would do it more ahead than right at the beginning. But, you know, which is why, like, personally, I enjoy these poems. Like, they sort of do things aesthetically that I enjoy, right? Even if it's not necessary, right? Artistically. There's another thing he has in mind, like a grave Siamese face 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profile reproach of. Like, and this refers to the what is the Siena city Italian painters during the medieval era, and they focused on like just like like Russian Orthodox like medieval painting. I guess like, it's like very similar, where you just get like holy figures and Jesus figures with with halos, like that kind of classical thing, and it's often kind of like very gaudy halos, right? I guess like back then people sort of approached it in this kind of like highly respectful, like crazy way. And he's like sort of like he's tapping kind of like a little bit of that old age, or like a grave Siamese face 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profile reproach of like imagine those like godlike figures, right? They're the ones that are looking at you still, after 1,000 years, their gaze at you, because you yourself, right? Like, I mean, clearly Henry himself is guilty. He's feeling guilty, whether or not actually something worthy of this guilt. Ghastly with open eyes, he attends blind. All the bells say too late. This is not for tears. Thinking, right? Who knows? Who knows if Henry cries about this? But Henry needs to get this down, right? Maybe this is part of the whole fucking like plan, right? Maybe this is part of like on some level, art is redemption, right? If you feel like you have failures in your life, as I do, as every artist inevitably does, it has to be that redemption. Like, if you're making sacrifices to be an artist, there needs to be some kind of redemption for that, right? So this thing, this making, this communication, right? It's not for tears. It's not to get lost in, right? If you want to get lost in it, let's construct a fucking maze called 385 Dream Songs, a book-length poem. Let's give you a book-length poem, right? For you not to cry about, but for you to get lost in productive fashion, right? You're going to think about it. And, emotionally in a sense, and also like in terms of like factual, like day-to-day reality for Henry, like, it could be too late for some things. Like, I forget off the top of my head whether like Henry is a character that's divorced, right? This is where like the John Berryman stuff comes in. Like, he was divorced several times. I don't know if Henry has ever been divorced in either the 77 or the 385 Dream Songs. But I mean, there's clearly plenty of things in Henry's life right now, even if we don't get too many specifics, that it could be too late for changes. It could be too late for crying about or feeling bad about, right? All that could be left to you is the thinking. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone, and hacks her body up and hide the pieces where they may be found, right? So this crazy fucking guilt, right? This guilt that he has, it may not even be totally rational. Maybe some parts of it are. Like, I doubt you would ever truly feel this guilty in your life, right? If you don't have something there. Right, so that's a reality. But he's now kind of literalizing it, right? He's like, I never did actually engage in this kind of behavior. How do I know? Because I go over everyone and nobody's missing, right? I keep having this check in my head, what am I hurting? Who am I hurting? What's happening? Did I really do this thing? I keep going over this tally, whatever it means, right? And this is why, so many of the Dream Songs feel so beautiful. It's because you don't get this kind of specificity, right? It is left open-ended to you. All right, so he knows he went over everyone and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn them up, right? This is a preoccupation. Nobody is ever missing, right? And I mean, it's a nice way to end that, right? I mean, it's shorter than some lines, but it has the same kind of like feel as thinking, right? You're sort of supposed to, like, this is the period, this is a short line. You're supposed to sit with it for a second, right? Nobody's ever missing, right? Is he shaking his head? Is he saying that? Right? He knows. He went over everyone and nobody's missing. Often he reckons in the dawn them up. Nobody's ever missing, right? What is that? What is that ending for? What is that preoccupation? If this is an end line, like, hello, like, it is important, right? Why? What is the reverberation here? And what is the implication here? Anyway, I was going to do this like long analysis here of Dream Song 29, but I was going to go through this, like, it's one of the longer pieces of criticism that I found, and it's actually pretty good in parts. Maybe if you guys want to read it, you can, Dream Song 29. But I'm not doing that. All right, so think of what we had just from 29, right? I had the most marvelous bit of luck. I died, right? That was poem 26. That was the ending of part 1 of the 77 dream songs. We opened up part 2 of the 77 dream songs. We opened up these dream songs by offering, like, kind of like, what is maybe if we don't want to pigeonhole ourselves into saying this is the chief preoccupation of Henry the character in the dream songs, we could say that it is a preoccupation, perhaps like a fairly robust preoccupation for Henry. This guilt, right? This feeling of, I have done something wrong, and I keep obsessing over this, but I can't quite find the kind of evidence that I want, right? Now, and we talked about this before, right? The Bangazara line, I'm only happy when I'm angry, I'm only happy when I'm sad. To what degree is this preoccupation, something that he needs to be Henry, generically, to be Henry specifically himself? But this is where we are contextually, right? And we've sort of, I think we've weaned away a bit, right, from the biographical sketches, right, from using that as a crutch, right? We've moved away from that. We know that Henry is part of John Berryman's personal life, but we moved away a little bit from that already, right? We're confident critics here, right? We're confident analysts. We're going to use our own understanding. We're going to use the universe, right, the cosmos of the book, right, to get everything that we need from these characters now. We use those anchors, right? We hooked ourselves in for the first few poems. Now we're transcending that. Dream song number 50. In a motion of night, they massed nearer my post. I hummed a short blues. When the stars went out, I studied my weapon system. Grenades, the portable rack, the yellow spout of the anthrax ray, in order. Yes, and most of my pencils were sharp. This edge of the galaxy has often seen a defense so stiff, but it could only go one way. Mr. Bones, your troubles give me vertigo and backache. Somehow when I make your scene, I cave to feel as if the roses of dawns and pearls of dusks made up by some old writer man got right for God and the greennesses of ours. Spring water grows so thick it gonna clot and the pleasing lady cease. I figure, yup, you is bad powers. Okay, so we have on the one hand, we have the blackface again, and here the blackface is to build on the kind of like, interpersonal wisdom and knowledge in Dream Song. What was it? In Dream Song, 26. Right. We had this. What happened then, Mr. Bones? You seems excited like. Right. What happened then, Mr. Bones, if you care to say. What happened then, Mr. Bones? This, like, he's wise enough to know how to pull the best material out of Henry. This same blackface character, again, he's given, I guess like interpersonal wisdom here as well, but he's given also something else. He's also given like direct poesy, direct poetry, right? Like, so the blackface character speaking, Mr. Bones, your troubles give me vertigo and backache. Somehow when I make your scene, I cave to feel as if. That's a beautiful way, right, of talking about how, someone might break down into his or her own emotions. I cave to feel as if, right? It's almost as if like, this feeling, right? I talk about this anger, that I'm only happy when I'm angry, when I'm sad. It's almost as if it's caving into this craving to feel as if, right? I mean, this is good poetry so far. Not exactly what I would call a minstrel show, I dare say. When I make your scene, I cave to feel as if the roses of dawns and pearls of dusks, made up by some old writer man, got right forgot in the greennesses of hours. Right? So these cliches, Mr. Bones, we don't have roses of dawns operating in this poem. Right? And if you think this is too much of a cliche, what about the pearls of dusks? What are the pearls? Is that stars, or are those the pearls? Are we talking about something else? It could be anything. Again, don't pigeonhole ourselves, but we could say that one possible interpretation is stars. And we know that it's a cliche because it's made up by some old writer man, right? And we know that it's a cliche because this cliche in our reality, our cosmos, our book, which represents reality, right? Which represents reality, not in the like generic day-to-day sense, but the meaning behind reality, the meaning behind suffering, the meaning behind like Henry's existential angst. We are here to say that those things, those cliches that don't really apply to life, guess what? They don't apply here, right? That old writer man, right, that writes these cliches, that doesn't actually exist. Here, it doesn't apply to us. Spring water grows so thick you're gonna clot and the pleasing lady cease. I figure, yep, use bad powers, right? I mean, this is kind of blackface. This is kind of like, I guess, like stereotypical sort of like voodoo type speak. I wonder to what degree, especially, back then, you would have like a Caribbean black person, like a Caribbean immigrant, or like maybe an intergenerational Caribbean. How many would actually like believe in voodoo? I once well, I still know her. She's Haitian, and she like straight up like believes in voodoo. And in fact, like I think that's like an above average thing that I've known, at least like in my anecdotal personal life. People that I know from the Caribbean, they they tend to believe in like voodoo type stuff often enough that in terms of it being used as a stereotype, like you just have to remember that yes, like you could stereotype black people into any kind of like behavior, misbehavior, whatever, like that happens and it's bad, right? Like it doesn't, like for art it doesn't work. But there's like a fine line between talking about stereotypes versus also talking about like cultural anomalies, no different than like when I did Ecclesiastes with that artifact. I think it was number 4 with maybe it was number 3 with Joel Parrish. When we did the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, I brought in like my cultural baggage, or like growing up Russian Orthodox, right, in religion, like that's relevant for the way that I think about religion now, how I relate to others. So this is depending on what we're talking about, we could be talking about like just a basic cultural like anomaly, right? I mean, we don't have to turn this into a fucking like pure minstrel show type thing. Like this could be used for a higher purpose, right? This could be used to say something of value about Henry because I mean, yup, like Henry, you is bad powers. Like it's true. Like isn't this the kind of irony? Like you want to like you want to criticize John Berryman for doing this, and yet, like I mean, like here we are, right? Like talk again and again, like depicting Henry in a kind of reality, refracted reality that is, I think strong enough that it should be part of the discussion in the sense that this blackface, to the extent that it is blackface, it is used for a much better purpose, right? That's what I would say. Dream Song 52. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed woke not Henry up. Bright, though, upon his workshop shone of Vice Central, moved in while he was doing time down hospital and growing wise. He gave it the worst look he had left. Alone, they all abandoned Henry, wonder, all, when most he under the sun. That was all right. He can't work well with it here or think. A bilocation, yellow like catastrophe. The name of this was freedom. Will Henry ever be on the lookout for women and milk, honor and love again? Have a buck or three? He felt like shrieking, but he shuddered as spring mist, warm rain, and handful with quietness vanished and the thing took hold. So we know that he died. We know that here we see him visiting a hospital. This is in the past tense, right? So whether this is a dead character or not, whatever. But like just chronologically speaking, this is going on after the time that he spent in the hospital. I chose this poem out because it's a nice kind of like little display of what's happening psychologically, like with Henry here. He says, like, alone, they all abandon Henry, wonder, all when most he under the sun. And like, what is he trying to say here? My guess is because like to the extent that he gets discussed and he's like all kind of like solipsistic, he's constantly like, sort of making the world the extent of his personal extent. Like his world is that world, right? You know what I mean? His world is the extent of his own emotions, his own kind of psychoses, his own thoughts, right? He's just kind of commenting here, like, I need this help more than anyone now, and everyone abandoned me, right? You can imagine, like, if you want to do the crutch thing a little bit, like, thinking about John Berryman, like maybe getting divorced and feeling, maybe abandoned by maybe at least one of the divorces, I imagine. He could have like been bitching this way to himself, right? That's a possibility, but I think it's better that we don't know exactly the nature of Henry's problems here, right? Because we could make these kinds of guesses and we could choose to bring biography in or not, and we could still come up with functional interpretations. And this very nice kind of like middle line, right? To say that this isn't just going to be about pure bitching, right? We're gonna start with some bitching. We're gonna do another pivot here. And we're gonna signify by saying that was all right, right? And the way that I would read it is, alone, they all abandon Henry, wonder, all when most he under the sun. That was all right. Okay, so after that was all right, let's do this pivot. And like I said earlier, just like, verbalize this to see if like you could find units of meaning that make more sense than purely read. Because again, like poetry ought to be read and like on the page, but sometimes your mind doesn't want to function what instinctively you might otherwise know. He can't work well with it here or think. A bilocation, yellow like catastrophe. The name of this was freedom. That's another pivot, isn't it? Right? We have a pivot here. That was all right. Here's a second pivot. Right? We're going to like mythologize this. We're gonna celebrate it. We're gonna praise it. We're gonna mythologize this thing that he felt. It's, you know, it's freedom. So therefore, that's gonna be like carte blanche to, you know, for Henry to essentially continue everything that he's doing. Perhaps repeat the same mistakes, right? I mean, like, look. None of this is explicitly stated in the poem. I get that. But we're building a fucking character based on evidence that's in the text. We're allowed to do that. It's okay, right? Nobody's gonna fucking like reach over and like, you know, like snip your balls for doing this, because they themselves won't have an interpretation at all to begin with. Probably, you know, how many academics that have like, you know, tons of shit out there. How many could sit down and just like wing this fucking poem? Like I read this poem once and I said like, whatever, let me think about it. And still, there's like endless shit to say. Like if you in fact enjoy this stuff, if this makes you curious, if this is a puzzle to work through, you know, we're allowed to do this, right? Will Henry again ever be on the lookout for women and milk? The answer is yes, he fucking will, because he interprets his crashes and his issues. He mythologizes it as freedom. So yes, he will be on the lookout for women and milk. And what a beautiful fucking, like, on the one hand, you get that like sexist dig at women by doing this, by labeling them even, period. But then like, and milk, like they are, you know, here for these like physical, for like a kind of like physical nourishment. Or maybe like the women aren't the nourishment, but the milk is, right? Milk is nourishing. Women, you know, maybe in Henry's world, women are not nourishing in his relationships with them. Will Henry again ever be on the lookout for women and milk, honor and love again? Have a buck or three, right? So, lost money, right? Lost money, lost the sex drive. That must hurt, right? We talked about all the stupendous achievements of his groin, right? That was earlier, right? So again, to say that it doesn't matter what order you read these in. To say it doesn't matter. His loins were the scene of stupendous achievement. That characterizes Henry. Here we have the other, like the flip side of that. Right? We know that he has that sex drive. Now he doesn't have it for whatever reason. What's going on? Right? We're building a fucking character, guys. Okay? And we can only do this by reading the first dream song. And now we have another dream song that builds on it. You could get a different meaning by reading this one first. This is true. But my feeling is, having read these a couple times now, there is enough logic here that reading them at random instead of, front to back, you're probably losing something. Will Henry again ever be on the lookout for women and milk, honor and love again, have a buck or three? He felt like shrieking, but he shuddered as spring mist, warm rain, and handful with quietness vanished and the thing took hold. Right? So he has like a physical thing he wants to let out, and he's being prevented here. Right? Something vanished and the thing. What is that thing? You're never going to know what that thing is. But the beauty is it's evocative enough, and there's enough evidence here that you could build it up, not only with the evidence in the text, but then ultimately imbue whatever the fuck you want to imbue upon it, which is also fine. Like I don't think over imbuing is necessarily a problem unless we don't have these other like structures in place already. Right? On some level, you have to engage in this kind of imbuing, because ultimately those imbuements, like if you're an artist, those imbuements are what makes it into your art. I believe. At least that's how I operate. I see, what has been imbued, right? And what has been done inappropriately, and how can this imbuement be saved in some way, right? This is something that I think about, guys. Dream song number 67. I don't operate often. When I do, Persons take note. Nurses look amazed, they pale. The patient is brought back to life, or so. The reason I don't do this more, I quote, is I have a living to fail. Because of my wife and son, to keep from earning. Mr. Bones, I sees that. They for these operation thanks you, what? Not pays you. Right. You have seldom been so understanding. Now there is a difficulty with the light. I am obliged to perform in complete darkness operations of great delicacy on myself. Mr. Bones, you terrifies me. No wonder they didn't pay you. Will you die? My friend, I succeeded later. And like just pure biographical, right? My friend, I succeeded later. Well, ultimately, he felt his ultimate successes were with the dream songs. I'm sure he felt this as he was writing them. And he said this later, right? This could be a piece of John Berryman's biography, but again, that's the most superficial reading. We know that there is like something about Henry that here feels like, hey, I am about to, if not actually succeed, right? I mean, he could just be saying this. He could be bullshitting this character that calls him Mr. Bones. But he could be cultivating the feeling of success, right? A person this self-destructive could of course be constantly cultivating the feeling of success, right? To paper over, right, the parts of his life where there is no success, right? This is just psychologically, this is what happens. And again, like, what is the function of this like so-called blackface? It's again like signaling to the reader that, hey, like, Henry is like is just flipping out again. And this is just such a mysterious line, right? Like, the reason I don't do this more, I quote, is I have a living to fail because of my wife and son to keep from earning, right? We know there's this kind of like self-destruction here. Perhaps Henry is resentful about something. Right? But this is a very nice way of phrasing, an unconventional kind of thought, right? Not many husbands and fathers would say this, right? So you would ask yourself, well, what does he mean by that? Okay. All right, so this is the last dream song before we get to some of the blackface analysis. Dream song 77. So this is, by the way, this is how dream songs end, right? So this is now part 3 of 3 parts in the first dream songs in 1964. And this is how that book ends. So like, if you would have been around back then, you would have purchased this book, right? You would have purchased the 77 dream songs. And just, think back the past week, this stream, what we've talked about. And just think about the fact that, like, what we started with, right? And holding the book in your hands, this is how ultimately we would end the book. This is how we would end the characterization of Henry. You're being promised, perhaps, I think he was promising dream songs at the time in the future. I think it was sort of like assumed that he would continue with this building on it. But functionally speaking, I mean, back then, you had to wait till 72 to get the rest of the dream song. So for 6 years, this is how the book ended. And what do you make of it, right? So think back to the present, think back to the beginning. Now let's think of the ending. Dream song number 77. Seedy Henry rose up, shy in the world, and shaved and swung his barbells, duded Henry up, and PA'd poor thousands of persons and topics of grand moments of Henry. Ah, to those less than none. With a book of his in either hand, he is stripped down to move on. Come away, Mr. Bones. Henry's tired of the winter and haircuts and a squeamish, comfy, ruin-prone, proud national mind and spring in the city so-called. Henry likes fall. He would be prepared to live in the world of fall forever. Impenitent Henry. But the snows and summers grieve and dream, those fierce and airy occupations, and love, raved away so many of Henry's years, it is a wonder that within each hand, one of his own mad books and all, ancient fires for eyes, his head full and his heart full, he's making ready to move on. That like, okay, doesn't this feel like an ending? Honestly, to anybody that says there is no chronology here worth speaking of, what about this doesn't feel in some way, I don't want to say final, because it's not final, but there has to be from 1 through 77, right? And 6 years before the next book, there needs to be some kind of closure. What is the closure? Okay, this is the closure. You hated my fucking blackface techniques? Guess what? We're gonna give you the most controversial shit on a fucking platter from the first line. Seedy Henry rose up in the world, right? Rose up shy in the world. We're gonna give that shit to you from the first line. Okay? We know that it's controversial. And shaved and swung his barbells, duded Henry up, and PA'd poor thousands of persons and topics of grand moments of Henry. Ah, to those less than none. Is that first of all, like, think of that description of Henry. Like, who's the, like, who's the one in the minstrel show? Anybody? Like, who's the one in the fucking minstrel show? Right? We know this is a controversy. Okay? We know this was controversial. Even when Mr. Bones is being just straight up attacked. I mean, if Mr. Bones, right? The appearance of Henry as Mr. Bones named by the blackface character, right? Every single time, right, that blackface character speaks, right? It's to push back against Henry. It's to turn him into like a clown. Mr. Bones, your troubles give me vertigo. Right? Roses and dawns and pearls of dusks made up by some old rider man, got right forgot, and the greennesses of ours. Henry's being pushed back again. Like Henry might as well be, right, the one in blackface, the one that's being made fun of. Shouldn't that be part of the discussion? Come away, Mr. Bones. Right? So after all this, right, after we get this, like, blowout of Henry, simple line, come away, Mr. Bones. Right? It, like, time to, I don't know, give you your pacifier, change your diaper. Whatever the implications of this line is. Right? Could be in the hospital. Could be metaphorically. Like, let's just, take you away. Let's make you normal for once. Let's dope you up with something. And Henry's tired of the winter and haircuts and a squeamish, comfy, ruin-prone, proud national mind. And spring in the city so-called. Henry likes fall. He would be prepared to live in the world of fall forever. What does that mean? Like, imagine that. To live in the world of fall forever. Like, what does that mean? What is that about? What would that look like? Because, I mean, it's a beautiful line. It's an image. You should stop and you should process it in your brain for a second. He would be prepared to live in a world of fall forever. And, like, there's something, like, I've said this before, like, there's something just so beautiful about decline, right? There's something so beautiful about, there's something so beautiful about a hint of ruin. I forget which writer has this. Who wrote this? I think it was a Japanese writer. Something about a I this is I must have it here. I have it up there. Yeah, I have it in my library. I think this is Snow Country by Kawabata, and Kawabata, I think is the better way to pronounce it. Um, it sounds like bullshit. It all sounds bad. In that book, he had a line that women. He used women as an example. Women are at their most beautiful, not when like you have this like fucking like porn cliche of like the nubile 18 or 20-year-old girl, 19-year-old teenager. And in Snow Country, he says, no, women are in fact most beautiful when there's like a hint of ruin, a hint of old age, essentially. And like I've sort of thought about that. Partly because like I'm not one of these people with like a young fetish. Just so. I mean, just like imagine thinking back to the way you were when you were like 18 years old. Like you were just or 20 years old. You were such a fucking kid. Like it's just kind of like disgusting to even think about. But anyway. There is like it seems like in literature and in poetry this like long line of beauty, like in some kind of like hint of ruin, right? Because we're not talking about winter, right? Prepared to live in a world of winter forever, like that is also I guess evocative, but it's evocative of something very different. Like with fall, we have the story of the cold, we have leaves falling, we have harvests, we have like the sense that there is something difficult that's coming, because it is going to be difficult in some regard, and like living always in that kind of almost, I don't want to call it a crisis, right? But there's always this like low grade anxiety, right? When we think of like fall imagery in some ways, well, maybe these are just my own psychological projections and imbuements, like maybe this is the point where if I were to write about something like this, my over-imbuement here, this is what's going to make it into my books, right? Maybe this is how it works, and I'm going to make it work in my own way. Whereas here, this is just my imbuement, right? So this is why I'm saying that over-imbuing is not necessarily bad, depending on what you're doing with it. And he explains why he wants to live in a world of fall, right? But the snows and summers grieve and dream, right? The snows grieve, and perhaps also the snows dream as well. Maybe the snows and summers both a piece, right? Grieve and dream. Those fierce and airy occupations on love raved away so many of Henry's years. It is a wonder that within each hand one of his own mad books and all, ancient fires for eyes, his head full and his heart full, he's making ready to move on. Right? This is clear closure, not total closure, not completion, not an end to end all ends. But this is a kind of closure, right? We've had closure here. We have guys. We have closure. This is not a randomly affixed number 77. Might as well be Dream Song number 7 in there, right? Not true.